The dust tasted of judgment. It coated her tongue, settled in the cracked corners of her lips, and clung to the damp strands of hair plastered to her temples. She did not try to spit it out. The effort was a currency she no longer possessed. Her world had shrunk to the circumference of the rough-hewn post behind her. The sun warmed with a dull, unyielding pressure against her spine. Its grain was a map of indifferent years pressed into her skin. Her wrists, bound in front of her with coarse rope, were numb. The rope had rubbed the skin raw hours ago, but the pain had since faded into a distant, thrumming ache, another sensation to be filed away with the hunger and the thirst and the shame. She kept her eyes fixed on a single, bleached stone half buried in the dirt street. It was smooth and white, an island in a sea of trampled brown. She focused on its shape, its stillness. If she looked at the stone, she did not have to see the boots that shuffled past. She did not have to see the faces that paused to stare, mouths twisted with a mix of pity, contempt, and a raw, ugly curiosity. A child, no older than 5, broke free from his mother's grip and toddled close, his face a perfect circle of wonder. He pointed a chubby finger. She did not flinch. She simply watched the stone. The mother snatched the boy back with a sharp hiss, a sound like a snake in dry grass, and dragged him away, muttering about filth and providence. The sun climbed higher, a merciless white coin in a bleached blue sky. It beat down on her uncovered head, making her vision swim at the edges. The murmur of the town, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a wagon, the thin strains of a poorly tuned piano from the saloon, was a language she no longer understood. It belonged to a world of the living, a world from which she had been neatly excised. She was a piece of wreckage washed ashore, a thing to be claimed or cleared away. Her past was a burned-out house behind her. Her future, this splintered post. There was only the heat, the dust, and the waiting. A man's voice, thick with liquor and self-importance, cut through the general hum. $5 for the lot. She ain't much, but she's got hands. Can scrub a floor, I reckon that was Brand. He smelled of cheap whiskey and sweat, a sour aroma that had preceded him into the small, dusty square. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist, as if bidding on livestock. A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd of onlookers. It was a dry, cruel sound, like sticks rubbing together. She did not look up. She felt the weight of their eyes on her, a physical pressure that was heavier than the sun. They were assessing her, measuring her worth in calluses and teeth. She was no longer a person. She was a bargain, problem, a story they would tell over supper. From the shadowed entryway of the mercantile, another man watched. He had been there for some time, still as a post himself, half hidden by the overhang. Elias Holt saw not a piece of wreckage, but the way her shoulders were held, a rigid line of defiance against the slack pull of the ropes. He saw the way her gaze was fixed on the ground, not in submission, but in a kind of focused refusal. It was the look of a creature that had burrowed deep inside itself to a place no one else could touch. He carried whole winters in his eyes. The loss of his Mary, and then the boy, had scoured him out, leaving behind a quiet, hollowed-out landscape. He had come to town for salt and flour, a trip he made only when necessity clawed at him. He had no time for the town's small cruelties, its casual brutalities. But he stood there, rooted to the spot, a bag of flour growing heavy in his hand. Brand swaggered closer to her, his shadow falling over her bare feet. "Come on now, Marshall. What's the bid? She's taking up space." Got a use for her back at the claim. He reached out, his thick fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She flinched. It was a small, sharp movement, involuntary as a heartbeat. For the first time, her eyes lifted from the stone and met Brand's. They were flat, empty, pools of dead water. Elias felt something shift inside him, a rusty gear grinding into place. It was not pity. Pity was a soft, useless thing. It was something harder, something forged in the lonely silence of his homestead. It was a plain recognition of injustice, stark and unadorned as a winter tree. He stepped out of the shadow. The movement was unhurried, almost lazy, but every eye in the small crowd turned to him. The dust puffed up around his worn boots. He stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable, carved from the same weathered wood as his cabin. "He owes me 10, Elias said. His voice was low, not loud, but it carried in the sudden quiet. It was a voice that sounded like it came from under floorboards, rough with disuse. He nodded his head slightly toward Brand. From the poker game last spring. Brand turned, his face a mask of belligerent confusion. "Holt, what business is it of yours?" "That debt," Elias said, his gaze as steady and unwavering as a surveyor's line. "I'll take her for it." A silence fell over the square, heavier than the afternoon heat. It was a preposterous offer. Not of money, but of a forgotten debt for a forgotten person. The town marshal, a portly man who preferred peace to principle, looked from Elias to Brand, his expression one of weary exasperation. Brand laughed, a short, barking sound. $10? Holt, you been out in the sun too long. I said 5-inch. Then you'll be $5 richer, Elias replied, his tone unchanged. And your debt to me is cleared. He did not look at the woman. His focus was entirely on Brand, a quiet, inexorable pressure. He was not asking. Brand studied him, a sneer playing on his lips. He saw the worn coat, the patched trousers, the profound weariness in the man's stance. He saw a lonely sodbuster playing at being a hero. But he also saw something in Elias's eyes that gave him pause. A stillness that was not empty, but full. A promise of trouble that would be quiet and long and absolute. "Fine," Brand spat, turning away in disgust. "Take the trash. Saves me the trouble of hauling it." He stormed off toward the saloon, his pride stinging more than the loss of a $5 bargain. The crowd, sensing the end of the spectacle, began to drift away, murmuring amongst themselves. They cast furtive glances at Elias, their expressions shifting from amusement to a grudging, uncertain respect. Elias waited until the street was nearly empty. He walked over to the woman, who had returned her gaze to the white stone, her anchor in the shifting world. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his trousers. The click of the blade opening was loud in the silence. She tensed, her shoulders tightening, but she did not move. He did not touch her. He reached around and sawed at the thick rope binding her wrists. The fibers parted with a dry, rasping sound. When the rope fell away, her hands remained clasped together for a long moment, as if they had forgotten how to be free. Then slowly they dropped to her sides. Red welts, angry and deep, circled her wrists. He folded the knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He picked up his bag of flour and turned, expecting her to follow. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a word. The debt was paid. The transaction was complete. That was all. She stood for a moment, swaying slightly on her feet. The post was no longer there to support her. She looked at her hands, turning them over as if they belonged to someone else. She looked at the empty street. Then, she looked at the back of the man walking away, a straight, lonely figure moving toward a dusty wagon at the edge of town. With hesitant, unsteady steps, she followed. The journey to his homestead was carved out of silence. The wagon wheels groaned a constant, rhythmic complaint against the ruts in the road, and the wind whispered through the tall, dry grass, but between the two figures on the wagon seat, there was nothing. She sat on the far edge, her hands folded in the lap of her ragged dress, her body angled away from him. She watched the landscape roll past, a blur of muted browns and pale greens under an immense, empty sky. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts of all they had left behind. After the first hour, the sun beating down, he reached behind the seat without a word and retrieved a dented metal canteen. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a long moment before taking it. Her fingers brushed his, a touch as brief and impersonal as falling leaves. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the first deliberate act of kindness she had known in so long that it felt like a shock to her system. She drank sparingly and handed it back. His homestead was little more than a scar on the vast, open plain. A small, sturdy cabin of weathered gray wood, a listing barn, and a few haphazardly fenced-in acres of turned earth. It was a place that did not invite visitors. It crouched against the land, braced against the wind, its windows like vacant eyes. To one side, under the shade of a lone, gnarled cottonwood, was a single, simple grave marked with a wooden cross. He brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. He began to unhitch the horse, his movements economical and practiced. He did not look at her or tell her what to do. He simply went about his work, leaving her to sit on the wagon, a still figure in a landscape defined by motion. The wind, the scuttling clouds, the rustle of unseen things in the grass. Finally, she slid down from the seat. Her bare feet sank into the cool, soft dirt. The ground felt solid, real, after the splintered boards of the town. She stood by the wagon, uncertain, a borrowed thing in a borrowed place. He finished with the horse and led it toward the barn. As he passed her, he spoke, his voice still rough. "Water pumps by the house. Food on the table when I'm done." He disappeared into the shadows of the barn without a backward glance. She found the pump, its iron handle cold and rusted. It took all her strength to work the handle, her muscles screaming in protest, until at last a gush of clear, cold water spilled into the basin. She cupped her hands and drank, then splashed the water on her face, washing away the layers of dust and grime. It was a baptism of sorts, cold and sharp and private. Inside, the cabin was one room, spare and clean. A narrow bed was in one corner, a stone fireplace in another. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. On the table was a half-eaten loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese under a cloth. It was a place stripped of all but the essential. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no sign of a woman's touch. It was the shell of a life, not the living of one. He had built a small loft, accessible by a crude ladder, and it was there, he indicated with a nod of his head, that she would sleep. He tossed a clean, folded blanket up onto the rough planking. "It's warm enough up there," he said, and that was all. The unspoken contract was laid. He would provide shelter. He would provide food. He would not lock the door. In return, she would, what? Exist. Be the silent witness to his silent life. It was a strange, fragile truce, built not on words, but on the vast, empty spaces between them. That night, curled in the scratchy wool of the blanket in the loft, she listened to the sound of his steady breathing from the bed below. She listened to the wind turning mean around the corners of the house. For the first time in a long time, she was not bound, and she did not know if that made her more or less afraid. The days settled into a rhythm, slow and predictable as the sun's arc across the sky. Their lives ran in parallel, rarely intersecting but always aware of each other. A language of shared work began to form, a vocabulary of silent gestures. She rose with the first pale light, climbing down the ladder from the loft while he was outside with the animals. She found a broom and swept the floor, the soft whisking sound a gentle counterpoint to the howling wind. She scrubbed the single pot and the 2 plates until they shone. She learned the quirks of the old wood stove, how to coax a steady, even heat from it. These small acts were an anchor, a way of staking a claim, not on the place but on herself. He would come in from the fields or the barn, his face etched with weariness, and find a plate of food on the table. He never commented, never offered thanks, but he always ate everything she had prepared. His silent acceptance was a form of communication, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. One afternoon, she found a pile of his shirts in a corner, torn and frayed. She took them, along with a small sewing kit she had discovered in a dusty box. Sitting on the porch step, she began to mend them. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of order imposed on chaos. He came back from mending a fence line and stopped, watching her for a long moment. Her head was bent, her fingers moving with a focused grace. He said nothing, but the next morning, she found a worn but thick shawl laid over the chair, a shield against the morning chill. She began to explore the edges of her new world. She walked the perimeter of the fenced land, her bare feet growing tough. She discovered a patch of stubborn wildflowers growing near the creek, their colors a startling rebellion against the muted landscape. She picked a small handful, blue and yellow and white, and, with a hesitation that felt like a prayer, placed them in a jar of water on the small, weathered cross of the grave beneath the cottonwood. Elias saw the flowers later that day. He stood before Mary's grave, his hat in his hands, and looked at the splash of color against the gray wood. It was the first brightness that had touched that spot in 3 years. A complex knot of emotion tightened in his chest. Grief, resentment, and something else, something he could not name. Felt like a trespass, and yet it also felt like a kindness. He left the flowers where they were. They worked together in the garden, their hands in the same soil. He would break the hard earth with a spade, and she would follow behind, crumbling the clods and planting the seeds. They moved in a synchronized, unpracticed dance, a silent partnership. One day, he was trying to fix the handle on a bucket, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. She watched him for a moment, then quietly picked up a small wedge of wood and a strip of leather. Without a word, she showed him how to brace it, how to bind it tight. He looked at her, then at her solution, and gave a single curt nod. He fixed it her way. It held. The bread she baked was often hard as a rock. One evening, he broke off a piece with a loud crack. He chewed it thoughtfully. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice flat. She looked up, startled. It was the first thing he had said all day, and it was not about work or weather. A faint warmth crept up her neck. "It's a little dry," she admitted, her own voice thin and reedy from disuse. "You didn't complain about mine," he pointed out. "His was always perfect." "Yours wasn't trying to break my teeth," she replied, and the ghost of a smile touched her lips before she could stop it. He almost smiled back. The corner of his mouth twitched. The moment passed, but it left a small, warm space in the air between them. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating a fabric of shared silence and small, accumulated decencies. The nights were the hardest. The darkness gave shape to the things she kept buried during the day. One night, a dream caught her, a memory of ropes and jeering faces and Brand's sour breath. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in the loft, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was dark, filled with the deep black of a moonless prairie night. Below, she heard the rustle of a blanket, then the scrape of a match. A small flame flickered to life, and in the wavering light of the lamp, she saw Elias sitting up on his bed, looking toward the loft. He did not speak. He just sat there, holding the light, a silent sentinel in the dark. Her breathing slowly calmed. The terror receded, chased away by the small, steady glow. He was not asking what was wrong. He was not offering empty comfort. He was simply sharing the light, holding back the darkness until she could find her footing again. She lay back down, but she did not sleep. She watched the lamplight paint soft shadows on the ceiling until the first gray light of dawn. A few days later, as they sat by the fire after their meager supper, the silence felt different. It was no longer a void, but a vessel. She gathered her courage, a small, hard kernel of it in her stomach. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She did not look at him, but stared into the flames. He knew what she was asking. He shifted in his chair, the wood creaking a complaint. He fed a small piece of wood into the fire and watched the sparks fly up. "Saw the way you looked at that stone on the ground," he said after a long while. "Like you was looking for something that wouldn't move." She said nothing, waiting. "My wife, Mary." He said her name, and the sound of it in the small cabin was both a wound and a balm. She was a fighter, but the fever, it took the fight out of her. At the end, she just got still. "I seen that same stillness in you. Didn't seem right for it to be owned by a man like Brand." It was more than he had said at one time since she had arrived. He had given her a piece of his past, a piece of his grief. He had explained himself not with logic, but with a memory. She pulled the shawl he had given her tighter around her shoulders. "Don't lock the door," she whispered, so quietly he might have thought it was the fire crackling. In the last place, they locked the doors. "I don't lock doors," he said, his voice low and steady. It was a promise. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. That night, a fragile trust was forged between them in the flickering light, a bond made not of grand declarations, but of shared wounds and the quiet offering of a name. The house, for the first time, felt a little less empty. The harbinger came on a Tuesday, carried on the wind. It was not a letter, nor a rider, but a faint, dark smudge on the western horizon. Elias saw it first. He was standing on the porch, sipping a cup of chicory, his eyes scanning the endless roll of the plains as he did every morning. His gaze sharpened. The smudge was too deliberate for a cloud, too slow for a dust devil. It was riders, 3 of them, and they were heading his way. A cold stillness settled over him. He knew with a certainty that went bone deep who they were. The peace they had carefully constructed, this fragile thing of routine and quiet understanding, was about to be tested. She came out of the cabin, a bucket in her hand on her way to the well. She saw the direction of his gaze and followed it. She saw the smudge and the way he stood rigid as a fence post. She did not need to ask. The fear was an old, familiar taste in her mouth. She set the bucket down, her knuckles turning white where she gripped the handle. He turned and looked at her. His face was a grim, unreadable mask, but his eyes held a question. "Will you run?" Her own eyes answered him. "There is nowhere left to run." She gave a single, small shake of her head. She would not leave him to face this alone. Something had taken root here, in this hard, lonely soil, and she would not abandon it. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Go inside," he said. It was not a command born of her weakness, but a statement of strategy. "Stay away from the window." She hesitated for only a second before obeying, disappearing back into the cabin's shadows. He remained on the porch, a lone figure waiting for the past to arrive. He did not get his rifle. To do so would be to escalate it from a confrontation to a fight, and he was not ready for that. Not yet. His defense would be his presence, his claim. This was his land. It took the better part of an hour for the riders to close the distance. They came on slowly, arrogantly, their horses kicking up plumes of dust. Brand was in the lead, flanked by 2 hard-faced men whose hands rested near the pistols on their hips. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the porch, turning the tidy yard into a battleground. Brand surveyed the scene with a proprietary air, the cabin, the barn, the woman's shawl still draped over a chair back. His eyes, small and greedy, finally settled on Elias. "Halt," he said, his voice smug. "Enjoying my property?" Elias did not rise to the bait. He remained leaning against the porch post, his arms crossed. "She's not your property, Brand. She was never your property." "I had a claim," Brand sneered. "A business arrangement. You interfered. I've come to collect what's mine. The marshal in town agrees." He signed a paper. He patted a pocket on his coat. "Says she's my indentured. Legal and binding." "A piece of paper from a coward doesn't make you right," Elias said, his voice still low and even. "It just makes him a coward." "I'm not here to argue philosophy with you, you dirt-scratching widower," Brand spat, his face flushing with anger. "I'm here for her. Send her out." No, the word was simple, absolute. It hung in the air between them, as solid and immovable as a granite boulder. Brand's men shifted in their saddles, their hands moving from near their guns to on them. The air grew thick with unspoken violence. The wind died down, and the land itself seemed to be holding its breath. "Don't be a fool. Halt," Brand warned, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "There's one of you and 3 of us. We can burn this whole pathetic place to the ground with you in it." From inside the cabin, she heard every word. She stood flattened against the wall, her heart a frantic drum. He was going to die for her. This quiet, broken man was going to be consumed by the fire of her past. The thought was unbearable. The passivity that had been her shield for so long cracked and fell away, replaced by a fierce, hot anger. She was not a thing. She was not a piece of property. She would not be the cause of his destruction. Her eyes scanned the small room. They fell on the fireplace poker, a long, heavy piece of iron resting on the hearth. Her hand closed around its cool, solid weight. Felt good. Felt right. Outside, Elias slowly straightened up, moving away from the post. He was putting himself squarely between the riders and his front door. "You can try," he said, "but this is my land. You're trespassing, and I will defend it." Bran chuckled, a nasty sound. "Defend it with what?" "Your righteous indignation." He started to dismount, signaling to his men to do the same. "Get her." Just as the first man's boot hit the ground, the cabin door swung open. She stood in the doorway, framed by the dark interior. She was no longer the hunched, defeated creature from the town square. Her back was straight, her chin was up, and in her hands, she held the iron poker, gripped like a weapon. Her eyes, no longer empty, burned with a cold fire as they fixed on Bran. "You will not touch him," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense silence with the sharp clarity of breaking glass. It was the first time Bran had ever heard her speak more than a single word, and the sound of it, the sheer force of it, stopped him in his tracks. Elias turned his head slightly, just enough to see her. He saw the poker, the defiant stance, the fire in her eyes. A strange, fierce pride swelled in his chest. She was not hiding. She was standing with him. Bran stared at her, momentarily speechless. He had come for a possession, a meek and broken thing. He was confronted by a woman. The sight of her, armed and defiant, threw his script into disarray. He had expected fear, tears, submission. He was met with a will as strong and unyielding as the iron in her hands. "Put that down, you stupid girl," he finally stammered, his bravado faltering. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I am doing," she replied, her voice steady. She took a step forward, out onto the porch to stand beside Elias. "I am refusing." The two of them stood there together, a united front. The grieving farmer and the discarded woman. They were not warriors. They had no real weapons to speak of, but they possessed a moral authority that Bran and his hired guns could not comprehend. They were defending not just a piece of land, but a life they had painstakingly built from the rubble of their pasts. One of Bran's men looked at his boss, then at the two figures on the porch, and then back at his boss. He had signed on for intimidation, for bullying a helpless woman. This was something else. This had the feel of a fight that, win or lose, would leave a permanent stain. He subtly shook his head. Bran saw the hesitation in his man's eyes. He saw the unyielding set of Elias's jaw. He saw the terrifying certainty in the woman's gaze. His bluster was built on the assumption of his victim's weakness. Confronted with strength, it crumbled into dust. He was a predator, but he was also a coward. He spat on the ground, a final, impotent gesture of contempt. "This ain't over, Holt," but his voice lacked conviction. He swung himself back into his saddle, his movements clumsy with rage and humiliation. "It is over," Elias said quietly. "Now get off my land." Without another word, Bran wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following close behind, leaving a trail of dust and defeated silence. They stood on the porch, Elias and the woman, and watched them until they were nothing more than a dissolving smudge on the horizon. The wind picked up again, blowing across the porch, rustling the shawl on the chair. The world returned to its normal sounds. The strength drained out of her all at once. The iron poker suddenly felt impossibly heavy. It slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the wooden boards of the porch. Her hands began to tremble. Elias turned to her. He didn't say thank you, or you were brave. Words were too small for what had just happened. Instead, he reached out, his calloused, gentle fingers closing over her trembling hand. His touch was warm and solid. Promise. An anchor. I was scared, she whispered, looking at their joined hands. I know, he said. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a small, soothing motion. You didn't run. She looked up at him then, and for the first time, she saw past the grief and the weariness in his eyes. She saw the man himself, steady and kind and true, and in her eyes, he saw not a victim he had rescued, but an equal who had stood beside him. The space between them, once filled with silence and uncertainty, was now filled with a shared, unspoken truth. They were no longer two lonely people living in the same house. They were a fortress. That evening, the air in the cabin was different. It was lighter. The shadows in the corners seemed less menacing. The fire in the hearth burned brighter, casting a warm, golden glow on the rough wooden walls. They ate their simple meal of stew and bread, the familiar silence between them no longer a space of caution, but one of comfort and deep, resonant peace. After they had cleared the 2 plates, Elias did not retreat into his usual quietude. He looked at her across the small table, his expression serious. The firelight played over the strong lines of her face, the resilience that had been forged in her gaze. She had been a ghost in his house, a nameless presence he had taken in out of a sense of duty. But she was nameless no more. She had a voice. She had a will. She deserved more. I cannot keep calling you woman in my head, he said, his voice low and earnest. It is not right. A person should have a name. She looked down at her hands, resting on the table. She had not heard her own name spoken with kindness in so long she had almost forgotten the sound of it. The name she had been called, girl, trash property, had been brands meant to erase who she was. To be asked for her name was to be asked to exist again. Lena, she said, the word soft, almost hesitant. My name is Lena. He tested the name on his tongue, letting the sound of it fill the small space. Lena, he repeated. It was a good name, a strong name, fit her. Lena, he said a third time, and this time it was a declaration. It was an acknowledgement, a christening. In that moment, the nameless woman ceased to exist, and Lena was born into the warm light of the cabin. He stood and walked over to a small, dusty chest in the corner, a chest he had not opened in 3 years. He lifted the lid, releasing the faint scent of dried lavender and cedar. After a moment of rummaging, he pulled out a dress. It was simple, made of dark blue calico, but it was well made and clean. It had been Mary's. He held it out to her. It is better than what you have. Lena looked at the dress, then at the ragged, dirt-stained garment she wore. That dress was a shroud. It was the uniform of her past life, of her humiliation. She stood and took the blue calico from his hands. The fabric was soft, cared for. The next morning, a thin column of smoke rose from behind the cabin. Elias found her standing before a small, bright fire. Into the flames, she had just thrown the tattered remains of the dress she had arrived in. They watched together as the cloth blackened, curled, and turned to weightless ash, carried away on the wind. It was a funeral pyre for the woman who had been tied to a post. A cleansing. Later that day, they worked together not out of necessity, but out of a shared purpose. They rebuilt a section of fence that had been leaning, weakened by the wind and years of neglect. He set the new posts, his muscles straining, and she followed, stretching the wire taut and nailing it into place. They moved with an easy rhythm, their actions synchronized, their purpose unified. They were not just mending a fence. They were building a boundary, defining their world, declaring it theirs and theirs alone. When the work was done, they stood back and looked at the straight, strong line of the new fence. It was a small thing in the grand scale of the plains, but it was theirs. It was a testament to their shared labor. That evening, as dusk settled over the prairie in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, they sat on the porch steps. It had become their ritual. But tonight was different. Lena leaned her head, just for a moment, against his shoulder. It was a gesture of profound trust, a quiet surrender. He did not stiffen. He did not pull away. He simply sat there, a solid presence beside her, and accepted the gift of her closeness. The house behind them no longer felt hollow. It seemed to breathe with them, its timbers settled, its windows no longer vacant but watching over the two figures on the porch. It was no longer his house, or a place of refuge for her. It was their home. The wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves above Mary's grave, and it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a lullaby. The land was still harsh, the winters would still be long, but they would not face them alone. In the vast, lonely quiet of the prairie, under a blanket of stars, two broken souls had found not just solace, but a family. And a name. This story, it isn't just about a rescue on a dusty street. It's about the quiet courage it takes to build a life from the splinters of what's been broken. It's about the way true strength isn't found in a loud voice or a ready fist, but in the steadfast heart that offers a blanket in the cold, that shares a meal in silence, that stands as a shield when the wolves come to the door. It is a story about being named, not by the world that wants to label you as property, or as a victim, or as forgotten, but by the one person who looks past the dust and the ropes and sees the human being underneath, and dares to speak their true name aloud, calling them back into the world. So here is your naming. You are not your past. You are not the labels they tried to give you. You are the quiet work of your own two hands. You are the courage to stand up after you have been knocked down. And if you are very brave and very lucky, you might find another soul out there in the wilderness, someone just as scarred as you are, waiting to build a fence with you, to share the silence, and to sit with you on the porch as the sun goes down, finally home.